Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad to be here with all of you tonight. Should be yet another great late night conversation. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Let's have another great late night chat, shall we?
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, 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 everybody. It is Saturday night. It is May 4th, the anniversary of the Kent State Massacre. Tomorrow is Cinco de Mayo, which is also the birthday of Karl Marx. And we are going to have yet another late night conversation. Glad to have you all here with us. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar, the way these streams work is I give my opening remarks. My opening remarks are about whatever it is I'm going to talk about for this evening. And then after that, after I give my opening remarks, I then give a roll call. And the roll call is basically an opportunity for us to find out who is on the other side of the camera. And that's always fun. Who's watching? We always have quite a diverse audience, a lot of people from a lot of different corners of the world. And then after that, I answer your super chat questions for the rest of the night. So if there's something that you would like me to touch on or talk about in the second half of our show, I would urge you to send me a Rumble rant if you're on Rumble, or send me a super chat if you are here on YouTube. And it's going to be a great night. I've got a lot of topics to talk about. So as far as announcements are concerned, the main announcement we're coming out of a great retreat we had last weekend in Vermont. 30 people, excellent, 4 days of bonding and exercise, new people joining CPI, etc. But our next big event is going to be in Washington, D.C. on July 7th. We are going to be organizing a rally. The theme that we have proposed, we're waiting to go ahead with it with our coalition partners. But the theme we have proposed for that rally is Oppose War and Empire, Defend Working Families. And that is the rally that is set to take place on July 7th. So if you're in D.C. or if you want to come to Washington, D.C., be in touch with us. The Center for Political Innovation is joining with the Party of Communist USA and the World Anti-Imperialist Platform for a rally around the theme of Oppose War and Empire, Defend Working Families. And that will be on July 7th, which is a Sunday. So that's the next big event that we've got in the works. Keep that in mind. So that's really the only announcement that I have to start out the night. I'm sure there's other things. There are some other projects that are in the works, but not yet finalized. We're looking to do some outreach at the Libertarian Convention that is coming up. I do want to urge you all, a good friend of ours, a new member of the Center for Political Innovation named Philip High, he has just made a petition to end sanctions on countries, and I will link that petition in the chat. Economic sanctions prevent people from getting the health care that they need. And, Philip High, he worded this petition that he made on change.org to oppose sanctions. He worded it very carefully, right? Because, there are different perspectives in our community. This petition that Philip High made, he made this petition. let me see if there's a better link for it. I can get a better link. He made this petition very carefully. The idea was that, that anyone could sign it. The person doesn't have to be a communist. The person doesn't have to necessarily even fully endorse the government that is affected. But they would be able to sign this petition on the basis of opposing sanctions that prevent people from getting the health care that they need. So here is the proper link to this petition that Philip has made. Philip is involved with a health ministry, with a church health ministry. So if you can sign this petition on change.org to make clear that you oppose devastating economic sanctions that prevent people from getting access to health care, I think that would be a great thing to do. So that's an announcement that I can make. And thank you for the reminder, Philip. I do appreciate that. If you can sign this petition, take some time to sign the petition to oppose sanctions on countries that prevent people from getting access to health care. I just dropped the link in both of the chats. That is an initiative that we can absolutely support. This is something to help our Cuban comrades, our Chinese, our Russian comrades, our comrades in Venezuela, our comrades in People's Korea, right? Devastating sanctions that prevent people from getting health care must be opposed. So thank you for that reminder, Philip. That's another announcement. So yes, July 7th is the big rally in Washington, D.C. That we are building for to oppose the NATO summit and the petition to oppose sanctions. So those are really the only announcement that I can think of at the moment. Again, there are some other things in the works. We're planning some kind of outreach at the Libertarian Convention, but I'm working out the details, trying to get funding in order and figure out everything and get magazines printed. And it's a whole big thing. So we're trying to figure that out. There are some other projects that are in the works as well. But that's what I've got in terms of announcements. So at this point, I'll just remind you one more time the way these live streams work is I give opening remarks. And then from there, after I give my opening remarks, we do a roll call where we find out who is on the other side of the camera, names and locations. Always very exciting to see who's watching. And then after that, I answer your questions for the rest of the night. We've already got one from John McCarthy about Tara shouting me out during the interview with Cynthia McKinney, which I think is great. Tara is a good friend, a heroic person who's been forced into exile, forced to flee the country to stay in Russia. It was great to see her when I was in Russia, and I look forward to answering that super chat. So yeah, super chats or Rumble rants, questions. That's what I do in the second half of the show. So think of something to ask me, think of something for me to react to in the second half of our program. And on that note, I'm going to just jump right into my opening remarks. So tonight, I decided to name this live stream, "The Future is in Eurasia." Now, what is Eurasia? Well, Eurasia is a great landmass that encompasses two continents, right? When we're in school, they teach us the different continents: North America, South America, Australia, Antarctica, Africa, Europe, Asia. Well, Europe and Asia are connected to each other. We consider them different continents, but they are connected to each other. And they form a great landmass called Eurasia. And in terms of geopolitics, people generally call Eurasia the world island, right? And some politicians call it the heartland. It is the bulk of the planet, right? The overwhelming majority of the planet is on the world island, the landmass that we call Eurasia. And Eurasia, Europe and Asia, that giant world island, that has been the most contested territory in the history of the world. World War I and World War II were fought over Eurasia. There was some fighting that happened in Africa, but most of the fighting in World War I and World War II was in Eurasia. World War I was mainly in the European part. World War II was in both Asia and Europe, but it was over Eurasia. And who would control Eurasia? And I contend that the future of humanity is in Eurasia. And I come at this with a Marxist understanding, but a more nuanced and sophisticated geopolitical understanding to compound my Marxist understanding. So let's start out with Marxism. Why would a Marxist think that the future of the world is in Eurasia? Well, we'll start out with a quote, right? This is from the Little Red Book of Mao Zedong. This is from Mao's Little Red Book. Mao said in 1957, when addressing a speech of the Communist and Workers' parties in Moscow, "It is my opinion that the international situation has now reached a new turning point. There are two winds in the world today, the east wind and the west wind. There is a Chinese saying, either the east wind prevails over the west wind, or the west wind prevails over the east wind. I believe it is characteristic of the situation today that the east wind is prevailing over the west wind. That is to say, the forces of socialism have become overwhelmingly superior to the forces of imperialism." Now, Mao Zedong said this in 1957. And why did he say this? Well, at that time, the Soviet Union was a socialist country. It had industrialized with socialist methods. It had become almost overnight, I mean, just very rapidly, a global industrial power. It had electrified itself. It had built a modern steel industry, a modern oil industry. It had repelled the Nazi invaders. It had launched Sputnik, the first spacecraft. It had launched the first human being into outer space, Yuri Gagarin. And the Soviet Union, which was in the East, it was marching ahead. And after the Second World War, a big chunk of Eastern Europe did the same thing. New countries, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, all these countries joined with the Soviet Union and became part of the Warsaw Pact. And they joined the bloc of countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union. And then in 1949, at that point, you had the Chinese Revolution, where the Chinese Communist Party established the People's Republic on the mainland. And so China began the course of industrialization. China built some of its first power plants before the Chinese Communist Party had come to power. There had not been a single steel mill in China, but the Chinese Communist Party built some of the first power plants in China, built some of the first steel mills. And then there was the northern half of the Korean Peninsula. And in 1957, as Mao gave this speech in Moscow, he was saying that it was pretty clear that the east wind would prevail over the west wind, and that the east represented the forces of socialism, and that the west represented the forces of imperialism. And this brings us to another important point, right? Because a lot of people look at communism and they see it as just one continuous thing, from Karl Marx all the way up to Occupy Wall Street. It's all the same. And they're wrong when they think that. And, you know, one common thing, a lot of people think that Karl Marx was Russian. Karl Marx was not Russian. Karl Marx was born in Germany, and he lived some of his life in Paris, and most of his life he lived in London. Karl Marx was not Russian. And Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, the guy who brought communism and socialism to Russia, they had some pretty big disagreements with each other. And Marx, he developed his theory of the class struggle, of the workers struggling against the bosses, the capitalists, the factory owners struggling against the wage workers, the employees. And he argued that eventually you were going to need to establish a system where the economy was not operating according to profit, but managed in the interests of society overall, would be called socialism. And Karl Marx thought that it would first come about in Germany, because Germany, he argued, was the most advanced, most revolutionary country, and he thought it would be in Western Europe that the revolution would happen. And after Karl Marx died, everyone saw that that was not taking place. That was not happening. So what was going on? Well, Lenin came along And Lenin came up with a new understanding. And he argued that the capitalism of Karl Marx's day had evolved into something completely new. And that brings us to Lenin. Lenin said, capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. And this booty is shared between 2 or 3 powerful world plunderers, armed to the teeth, America, Great Britain, Japan, who are drawing the whole world into a war over their division of the booty. So you look at this. Capitalism, Lenin argued, had developed into a system where the corporations, the trusts, cartels, and syndicates based in the Western capitalist countries, America, Great Britain, Germany, Japan, etc., that the corporations based there were spreading their tentacles all across the planet, and they were extracting profit by preventing countries in the developing world, in the East, from developing. They were preventing countries from rising up out of poverty. They were holding back development and seizing parts of the world as captive markets. In the early ages of capitalism, countries exported products, right? You know, if a country had a company that made tires, the country would export tires. If the country, had a, exported pencil, had a company that made pencils, they exported pencils. But nowadays, we live in the era of the export of capital, meaning it is not the commodity that is exported. It is the corporation. We don't export French fries. Instead, we export McDonald's all over the world. We don't export electrical equipment. We export General Electric, and General Electric Corporation has headquarters all over the world. And the corporations based in Western countries spread their tentacles all across the world and held back development. And this stage of capitalism that Lenin discovered was called imperialism. And Lenin called it the highest stage of capitalism. And there's many, many examples of imperialism. If you want to understand the economics of imperialism that I talk about, there's a few examples that I give. There's many, many examples that one could give. But one great example is an example that I often use, which is, what is the top oil exporting country on the African continent? What is it? It's Nigeria. Nigeria is the top oil exporting country in Africa. No country exports more oil on the African continent than Nigeria. So you would think that the Nigerians would be very rich because they have more of this very, very valuable item, oil, than anybody else on the continent, except the Nigerians are very poor. They have a very low life expectancy. They have a very low rate of literacy. There is going to possibly soon be a crisis of malnutrition in Nigeria. Nigerians don't live very long. They don't have very much education. They don't have very much electricity. Why is this? Why is it that a very wealthy country with a huge amount of oil is so poor? It's because of the export of capital. The export of capital. The corporations that control Nigeria's oil are ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. And the Nigerians don't control their own oil. The Western countries, America and Britain, have exported their corporations to control Nigeria's oil resources. So the wealth that comes from Nigeria's oil, it goes into the pockets of Wall Street corporations, and the Nigerians remain poor. Another example of imperialism that I give is the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. The people of Mexico have been growing their own food since before Christopher Columbus ever came. The Mexican people know very well how to farm. However, in the 1990s, Bill Clinton signed an agreement called NAFTA. And NAFTA created a situation where American agribusiness was able to flood the market of Mexico with cheap commodities, cheaply produced food, and put all the local Mexican farmers out of business. And now there's very little food produced in Mexico, even though the Mexican people have plenty of arable land And even though the Mexican people have been growing their own food for thousands of years, now they buy almost all their food from the United States. They import their food from the United States. They have been a captive market, right? They've been underdeveloped by imperialism. They don't have the wealth coming from producing their own food. Instead, they have to import all of their food from the United States. And as a result, they remain in poverty. And this is called the export of capital, right? The American agribusiness corporations have been exported to Mexico. And that's another example of imperialism. Imperialism is when the British Empire went to India and they burned all the textile looms, right? And they burned those looms down and they forced the people of India that had been weaving for thousands of years to import all their cloth from Britain because they had their local corporations put out of business and they became a captive market for the British Empire. Imperialism is about holding back economic development. There's many other examples of this that you can point to, of the export of capital, of corporations from the West coming in and crushing the economy of developing countries and reducing them to becoming what they call client states, where they have to purchase everything from the Western countries. They don't produce their own products. Another great example, after the fall of the Soviet Union, right? At the time of the Soviet Union, Russia had all kinds of farms. Russia had all kinds of steel mills. But when the Soviet Union fell, the state farms, the collective farms went out of business, and Russia began having to import all of its food from the United States. And at the time that the Soviet Union existed, Russia produced all kinds of steel. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, American firms purchased the Russian steel manufacturing, and then they closed them down, and Russia had to import all of its steel from the United States. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was economic looting of Russia, and that economic looting was about reducing Russia to being a captive market that had to import its food, had to import its steel from the United States. And this is what imperialism is. And the main thing that imperialism does is it holds back development. It also engages in the seizure of raw materials, right? It makes, it goes to Nigeria and gets control of their oil, right? It goes to African countries and gets control of their minerals, right? So it seizes raw materials and it exports corporations. That's what imperialism is. And imperialism is a stage of capitalist development that is holding back countries around the world from raising their people out of poverty. And now, what did Lenin say when he talked about imperialism? He said, capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. And this booty is shared between 2 or 3 powerful plunderers armed to the teeth who are drawing the whole world into war over their division of the booty. And that's what World War I and World War II were about. World War I was that the British and the American imperialists who teamed up with the French imperialists, they were trying to dominate the world. And in addition to that, you had the German and the Austrian imperialists, and they wanted a chunk of the world for themselves. And so the German and Austrian imperialists battled the American and the British imperialists, and the Germans lost. And at the end of World War I, the Germans were stripped of their colonies. And then we know what happened, which is Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, and he started trying to re-seize the colonies of German imperialism, right? That Hitler wanted to make Germany an empire once again. He launched what he called the Third Reich, and he was trying to re-seize and reestablish German imperialist power. And so the British and the American imperialists teamed up with the Soviet Union that was also facing a threat from Hitler, and Hitler was defeated, and Germany was once again stripped of its colonies once again. And that imperialism is the driving force behind wars, and that this Western system of imperialism is about holding back development. And because of imperialism, the working class in the homeland became divided between the more skilled and well-paid workers, the aristocracy of labor, some people talk about the industrial middle class, and the lower working class, right? And that the higher paid workers, because of the fact that they're getting higher wages because they live in the center of imperialism, they stopped being revolutionary and they started supporting their government and its wars. And the major socialist parties sold out and supported World War I when it broke out because they were tied in with imperialism. And so at that point, Lenin argued that the revolutionary energy to build socialism was not going to come from the Western countries. It was instead going to come from the East. And what else did Lenin change from Karl Marx? What else did Lenin change from Marx's teachings? Well, Marx had opposed nationalism. Marx had said it's about the working class against the capitalists. And Marx had said that he wanted to break down national divisions. He wanted the German workers and the French workers to join hands against the bosses. He wanted the British workers and the American workers to join hands against the bosses. He wanted to break down national divisions. However, Lenin argued that in the struggle to defeat imperialism, nationalism of the oppressed countries could be a good thing. Now, Marx started to realize this in the final years of his life. As Marx was getting older, he lived in London, and he realized that in London, in Britain, the main struggle was at that point a struggle between the British Empire and the Irish people. And the Irish people were a colonized people. And Marx realized that the nationalism of the Irish people could be good because it was at that point the Irish people were fighting for their national liberation. And so Marx started to support Irish nationalism, realizing that it was progressive because it was a struggle against imperialism. And Marx also supported Polish nationalism. He saw that Poland was a colonized nation, and he began to argue that nationalism among the Polish people could also be revolutionary. And so you saw Marx starting to shift in the final years of his life. And I want to show you, it just takes me a second here. I actually want to show you a very important quote from Karl Marx that really articulates the way Marx saw things in the final years of his life as he was starting to recognize the importance of nationalism. So hold your horses. Hold your horses. I'm going to find the quote and I'm going to put it on the screen. So if you just hold your horses here, I will put it on the screen. I will actually put that Marx quote on the screen. But Karl Marx became a big supporter of the Irish national liberation struggle. And that was not characteristic. Here we go. That was not characteristic of Marx because Marx was against all nationalism. He said that nationalism is reactionary. He said his goal was to break down national divisions. But then in the final years of his life, he came to the revelation that, at least in the case of Ireland and Poland, national liberation struggles could be progressive. And so Marx famously said this, and I will put this on the screen. Hold on. Just got to send you the screenshot. It's always good to show the quotes on the screen, right? Not just read them to you, but show them to you because they are very important. So hold on. This is what Karl Marx said in the final years of his life. All right, here we go. This is what Marx said about the Irish people and their struggle for national liberation. Marx said, Ireland is the bulwark of the English landed aristocracy. The exploitation of that country is not only one of the main sources of their material wealth, it is their greatest moral strength. They, in fact, represent the domination over Ireland. Ireland is therefore the cardinal means by which the English aristocracy maintain their domination of England itself. Thus, to hasten the social revolution in England is the most important object of the International Working Men's Association. The sole means of doing so is to make Ireland independent. It is therefore the task of the International to bring the conflict between England and Ireland to the forefront everywhere and to side with Ireland publicly everywhere. The special task of the Central Council in London is to awaken the consciousness of the English working class that for them, the national emancipation of Ireland is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation. And so Marx is saying that the English workers can't be free until the Irish are free, and that defeating the British Empire in England will help bring forward the liberation of the English workers from capitalism, and that therefore it is in the interest of communists and socialists in England to support Irish nationalism. That is a very, very, very important point. And I will show you how seriously Karl Marx took this point. I will show you a picture. Again, playing catch up here. I didn't know I was going to go here, but that's okay. Here's a very, very important picture that will show you how seriously Karl Marx took this point, or at least his family did. This is Karl Marx with his daughter. Karl Marx with his daughter, Jenny. Now, what is odd about that picture? There's something about that picture that you should notice, right? That's Karl Marx sitting there, and that is his daughter, Jenny. And his daughter, Jenny, is wearing something around her neck. What is she wearing? She is wearing a cross. Now, what is odd about Karl Marx's daughter, Jenny, wearing a cross? Well, Karl Marx's daughter, Jenny, was an atheist. And Karl Marx and his wife were both of Jewish heritage. So why is Jenny an atheist, the son of two Jewish atheists, the daughter of two Jewish atheists, an atheist herself, of Jewish descent? Why in the world is she wearing a cross around her neck? What sense does this make? Why? Because the main excuse that the British Empire used for oppressing the Irish people was that they were Roman Catholic, right? England at the time was a Protestant country, and the Irish were Catholic. And so the British oppressed them and exploited them on the basis of the fact that they practiced Roman Catholicism. So Karl Marx and his daughter Jenny was so dedicated to showing solidarity with the Irish people that she wore a Roman Catholic cross around her neck. I believe she wore a crucifix. Now, that cross does not look like a crucifix to me, but my understanding is that Jenny Marx wore a crucifix or a cross around her neck that was explicitly Catholic to show solidarity with the Catholic people of Ireland who were being colonized by the British because they were fighting for their liberation. And Marx understood that the defeat of the British Empire in Ireland would advance the entire global working class movement. So that's an important thing. So when we talk about Marxism, but in the age of imperialism, we're talking about something different. We're talking about a movement that says that the revolutionary energy is in the East, not in the West. We're talking about a movement that embraces nationalism of countries that are oppressed by imperialism and says that that nationalism of oppressed countries, that nationalism can be progressive. Now, this is all very, very important. So from there, very good point, John, and I will, of course, address that in the second half of our show, but that's a very good point. So that then brings us to another point, which is that with this new understanding of Marxism, that the struggle is against imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage, that the Western countries have become less revolutionary because the working class is divided, that with this understanding that the nationalism of oppressed people can be revolutionary, we have the rise of the Bolshevik movement in Russia. And Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, he develops a whole different method for building a revolutionary organization. right? The communist groups and the socialist groups of Europe are ultra-democratic in the way that they operate, right? That they are very, very much, everything is done in an ultra-democratic manner, almost by consensus. Well, Lenin comes along and he says we have to have a party of new type that engages in democratic centralism. And our party isn't for everyone who agrees with us. Our party is reserved only for those who give the whole of their lives. Well, that's the language he used, the whole of their lives for the revolution. And that the party engages in agitation to stir up the masses. And it engages in propaganda, teaching communist ideas to the advanced. It agitates the masses and it propagates the advanced. And the party practices democratic centralism, meaning that they have debate about what they're going to do, but once the decision is made, every member of the party is obligated to carry it out, whether they agree or disagree. Right? Once a decision is reached, all members are bound by that decision. The party marches as one. And furthermore, they keep their disagreements internal. Right? They don't let all the things they disagree about go out to the public. They have one united face to the masses, and that is communicated through one specific party newspaper or party publication. Right? That's Leninism. And across Europe, the Marxists and communists of Europe look at the Bolshevik organization, and they say the Bolshevik organization is very different, very, very different indeed, than the various communist groups that exist in Europe. And they say that it resembles a monastic order. It's almost like a group of priests or monks, and that they are not the same kind of radical organization that you see. They call it a cult. That is the language that is used. They describe it as a cult or a sect, a group of fanatics. And they operate very, very differently. And then we know what happened from there, which is with their theory of imperialism, right? The Bolsheviks were able to make a revolution, and that they were able to overthrow capitalism and establish the Soviet Union, right? That they used the opportunity of World War I, which was a very unpopular war, and they used that war to create unrest. And they became known as the party that was against the war. They were the anti-war guys. And in February of 1917, the Tsar was toppled. And then in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks took power on a platform of peace, land, and bread. They were known as the party that would end the war, and they took power because the people did not want to continue the war. And so they took power on a platform of peace, land, and bread. And of course, they're then invaded. There's a civil war. All kinds of people die. It's very awful, but the Bolsheviks win the civil war. And after they win the civil war, they then have the problem of trying to build socialism. And what is socialism going to look like? What does it mean? How are they going to build a socialist society? And the question comes up, what does it mean to build socialism? Right? What does it mean? And there's a lot of debate about it. And Trotsky, of course, says they really should just focus on spreading the revolution to Western Europe. But Lenin says something different. And what does Lenin say? Lenin says, communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. Now, what does that mean? Communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. It means that with our revolutionary government, we will industrialize the country. We will raise it up to modern levels. Electrification was modern technology back then. Communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country, meaning that the Bolsheviks had the job with their Soviet power, with their revolutionary government, to electrify and make Russia into a modern industrial society. Trotsky, of course, does not agree with that. And the disagreement between Stalin and Trotsky after Lenin died was much deeper, much deeper than simply a political question. It was actually a geopolitical question, And the first person to acknowledge that the difference between Stalin and Trotsky was much deeper than just a question of ideology. It was actually a geopolitical disagreement. The first person to acknowledge that is Trotsky. Trotsky wrote this book, Stalin, an appraisal of the man and his influence. And it's Trotsky explaining who Stalin was, where he came from. And if you read chapter 1 of this book, chapter 1 begins by saying that Stalin was Asiatic. Stalin was Asiatic. That's what chapter 1 says. The first page of the book begins by explaining that Stalin was not European, that Stalin was from Georgia. And you look at the words here. Paragraph after paragraph, it goes on for several pages, talking about how Stalin was not European. Stalin was Asiatic. And Stalin, he put forward a program called Socialism in One Country. And Trotsky put forward a program of permanent global revolution. And that was their disagreement. Alexander Dugin, a very important Russian political theorist, he says this about the division between Stalin and Trotsky. He says, Soviet Russia in the Stalin period represents a new version of the great Turonic Eurasian Empire, the core of the land-based civilization. Trotsky, while he was still living in the USSR and with great persistence after his immigration, advanced the idea that Stalin's state had betrayed communism and recreated an imperial bureaucracy of the czarist type at a new stage. Thereby, Trotsky tore socialism away from its Eurasian context and ascribed the peculiarities of the USSR, which he criticized, to a return to a Russian national strategy. A different point of view characterizes some contemporary Marxists, for instance, Konstavo, Preve, who see an internal connection between socialism and continentalism, the civilization of the land, and thereby consider the victory of socialism in land-based Russia and later in other land-based traditional societies such as China, Vietnam, and Korea as not an accident, but a regularity. Now, Alexander Dugin is not a Marxist. He has a Marxist background, but he is what you call a Eurasianist. And Alexander Dugin sees the Soviet Union and the rise of socialism around the world. He sees this as a result of the clash that goes on for thousands of years between civilizations of the land and civilizations of the sea. And that there is a fundamental difference in how civilizations of the land develop and civilizations of the sea develop. Civilizations of the land require economic development. In order to have trade, they need to build infrastructure, they need to build roads, and they need to connect different provinces with each other. Whereas civilizations of the sea only require a militarized sea force to control the trade routes. And so civilizations of the land have to develop with the regions that they are trading with, whereas civilizations of the sea can plunder and hold back the development of the people they trade with and exist simply as being middlemen. The Roman Empire is a classic civilization of the sea. They said all roads lead to Rome because the Roman Empire enforced itself as the global middleman in trade. And the British Empire very much considered itself to be a sea-based empire. And there is a novel, or not a novel, but a book considered the first book of Geopolitics. I'm going to pull up the name of it. It's by Alfred Mahan, right? And Alfred Mahan, who was a naval officer, he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, where he argued that the way to rule the world is to control the sea. And his writing, Alfred Thayer Mahan, became the basis of modern geopolitical thinking. And the British Empire very much talked about modern geopolitical thinking in terms of Eurasia versus Atlanticism or versus Oceania, of civilizations of the land versus civilizations of the sea. And the British Empire, the German Empire, and the American Empire studied the works of Alfred Thayer Mahan and constructed gigantic navies and gigantic military forces to control global trade routes and enable their corporations to dominate the world. Whereas, if you look at the Chinese empires and dynasties that go back thousands of years, if you look at the Russian Empire of the Tsarist years, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, they had a very different relationship to the countries that they traded with because these were land-based empires that focused on development. And the British Empire, these were sea-based empires. The Roman Empire, based in Italy, the British Empire, based in Britain, the American imperialist empire, based in Wall Street, New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles. These are empires of the sea, and that empires of the sea hold back development and exist as middlemen, making everyone who trades trade through them. And empires of the land focus on development because they are forced to build roads and they are forced to make the countries they trade with wealthier in order to make themselves wealthier. And that these two different models of empire that develop throughout history define two different types of civilizations: civilization of the sea and civilization of the land. And what Lenin is talking about in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is specifically referring to empires of the land. That is what or of the sea. That's what he's talking about. Lenin's concept of imperialism, the system of colonial oppression and financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of countries that Lenin talks about, he's talking about the British imperialist model of empires of the sea that was copied by the Germans, copied by the French, copied by the American imperialists. And it's very much a Western European and American model of global trade based on military force and holding back development. Whereas the empires of the East, China, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, etc., they have a very different way of doing things. Now, this is Dugan putting the Marxist understanding of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, into a broader understanding of the fact that there seems to be two different types of civilizations throughout history. So what we are seeing now is that the Western capitalist countries, we are empires of the sea. And the empires of the sea have a philosophy called liberalism, which is the celebration of the individual. The empires of the sea promote liberalism. And what is liberalism about? And this is very interesting, right? Why was Rome a republic? Why did Rome have an elected republic government when it began? Why? Well, Caleb, that's because the Romans were just so enlightened and they believed in human rights and they wanted the Roman people to have a say in how they were governed. Bullshit. The Romans, the overwhelming majority of the people that lived in Rome were slaves. They practiced very, very brutal gladiatorial shows and torture and mass murder. The Romans did not believe in human rights. Why was Rome, the Roman city-state that established the Roman Empire, an empire of the sea, why was Rome a republic? Why did they have an elected national assembly? And why did they have a hereditary senate rather than just a king, like most city-states at the time had? because they needed to motivate everyone to go out and build the empire. That's why they needed every individual land-owning Roman to feel like he had a say in how the loot would be divided. And if it was just one king who ruled, the other people, the other landowners, the other non-slave Romans who owned land wouldn't feel like they had as much of a stake in expanding the empire. But if all the top landowners had a seat in the hereditary Senate and all the landowners got to vote and elect a national assembly, they would be much more motivated to go out and conquer and wage their wars because they got to divide some of the loot. And liberalism, individual rights, goes back to Greece and Rome, and it was understood that you can hold an empire together and you can create more motivation for people to go out and plunder and conquer other peoples if they feel that there is something in it for them in particular, for their individual self, right? People are far more likely to go out and plunder if they think they're going to get some of the loot. They're far more likely to plunder if they think they're going to get some of the loot than simply if they just think it's all going to go to some king. And that the Roman Empire was a republic and Athens was a republic because of the fact that this was a way to motivate people on an individual level to go out and build the empire. And it worked for a significant amount of time. However, what did it lead to? It led to the rise of various figures they called populares or populists, who began trying to redistribute wealth to the poor Romans. And this is an important aspect of that history, right? We have the Gracchi brothers that emerge in ancient Rome. And the Gracchi brothers are two military leaders who want to dominate Roman society. So they build an army of poor people and they go into Rome to seize power. You have the rise of Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar became a champion of the proletarians. The proletarians of Rome were neither slaves nor masters. They were the men of no property. The word proletarian literally means to procreate, to have children, because their only property was their children. They did not own any land. They did not own any slaves, but no one owned them. They were wage workers. And Julius Caesar rose to power as a leader and champion of the proletarians and the smaller landowners against the big landowners. And the republic in Rome started to have big problems because the Romans all had their different individual interests. And because they had their different individual interests, there was disagreement among them. And you had figures like the Gracchi brothers and figures like Julius Caesar, who seized power and tried to centralize authority in their hands, had different visions about how to build the empire. And we all know what happened to Julius Caesar. He was stabbed to death by the wealthy senators. They feared that because he was popular with the proletarians, that he would take away some of their power, that he would redistribute some of their wealth. And so they killed Julius Caesar. And we all know that eventually Rome abolished the republic and became an empire and became under the rule of a single emperor, because the republic, the Roman Republic, because it had different factions within it, because the Roman elites were struggling against each other, it could not remain intact. And the Roman Republic eventually collapsed into the rule of the emperors. But that did not end the individualism. The Roman elites wanted different things, and they facilitated this disagreement. In Rome, for example, they had what they called the mystery religions. They had the navy of Rome, and the leaders of the navy had their own religion. They worshiped the god Neptune, the god of the ocean, and they had special religious ceremonies and special practices to worship Neptune, the god of the ocean. The army in Rome, they worshiped Mars, the god of war, the god of red, and the red planet Mars. And they worshiped Mars, the god of war. And they had special temples and special ceremonies and special teachings for the army. And that Roman society increasingly became very, very divided because the Romans were very individualistic. But this individualism had been cultivated by the Roman Empire in order to make it more effective as a plundering empire. Individualism was about motivating people, right? It's the understanding that if we're going to build an empire, we're going to conquer the world, we need to motivate people to build it on an individual level. That was the idea, right? That we need to motivate people individually, appeal to their own self-interest. And so the Roman Empire, as we see, it eventually becomes very, very divided because all the different elites are worshiping different gods. All the different elites have different ideas and different beliefs. It gets to the point they can't even have a republic anymore. They kill Julius Caesar. And then we also know what ultimately happened at the end of the Roman Empire, that as all the Romans are worshiping many different gods, as they all have many different beliefs, Rome becomes Christianized, and they adopt Christianity as the state religion in the hopes that they can get all the Romans to worship one single God, in the hopes they can try to hold the empire together. But it doesn't work. And in the final years of the Roman Empire, the Romans are unable to raise an army. And that is the final death knell of the Roman Empire. The barbarians, that's what they called the Germans, the Germanic tribes, the pagans, the barbarians of Germany, are fighting with the Romans. And the Romans are unable to build an army of their own people to fight the Germans. So what do? They go to Germany and they hire other Germans to fight them because they cannot even motivate their own people to go out and build an army to defend their empire. And the Roman Empire falls apart because the individualism that originally motivated the empire to be built leads to the empire completely coming apart. There is no unified vision. Everyone's doing their own thing. Everyone has their own self-interest. They're worshiping their own gods. And at the end, they can't even get an army together to defend the place, right? Liberalism, which started out as a way to motivate an empire of the sea by making sure that people get a share of the tribute and that decisions are made through a process where people feel like they have a say, ultimately leads to the Roman Empire coming apart, right? This is important to understand because this is what's happening on an ideological level in the Western countries in our time. Britain and America are coming apart with liberalism. There is no central vision for the United States. There's no central vision for Britain, right? And we empires of the sea are deteriorating from within because the ruling elite, the billionaires that rule our country, all have different visions and different ideas about what they should do, and they're coming apart. And there is also an economic problem beneath it, which is the tendency of the falling rate of profit, the problem of overproduction, what Peter Coffin calls value crisis, and we talk about that on other streams, right? The fact that self-driving cars leads to mass unemployment. If we adopted self-driving cars, there would be riots in the streets. The fact that people are homeless because there are too many houses. People are hungry because there is too much food. The fact that the greater that technology advances, the poorer people get. This problem in capitalism, that great technological leaps are followed by long-term economic meltdowns. We have a great technological leap, the computer revolution, which is leading to a big economic crisis. At the same time that the liberal ideology that was the foundation of the Western societies, which originally motivated people to go out and be colonizers, now has the elite pulling in all kinds of different directions. The elite are no longer loyal to each other. All of this is leading to this system of imperialism that Lenin described, the Western civilization of the sea, capitalism in its monopolistic stage coming apart. Meanwhile, in Eurasia, in Russia and in China, we have two countries that had communist revolutions. And those two countries in the 20th century, they had communist revolutions. But those communist revolutions have evolved and changed. Now, in Russia, they had the communist revolution. And at the beginning, you had a lot of people in that communist revolution, like Trotsky, like Bukharin, like others who were very much oriented toward communism spreading to the Western countries. But what started with Lenin continues with Stalin, right? When Trotsky calls Stalin Asiatic, he's right, except that's a good thing, not a bad thing, right? Stalin had very much an orientation towards civilization of the land rather than civilization of the sea, right? I frequently quote Simon Sebag Montefiore talking about how Stalin's orientation as a thinker and a leader was very much rooted in his upbringing and his training in seminary school, and that many of Stalin's opponents criticized him on this point and pointed out that Stalin taught like a priest, and Stalin maintained the teaching, the methods of explaining things and understanding the world that he was taught in a Russian Orthodox seminary school. And even though Stalin was, according to all accounts, an atheist, Stalin very much had an orientation that came from the thousands of years of Russian civilization. Stalin grew up in a village in Georgia. His father was a bootmaker, and Stalin very much had the orientation that came from the peasantry of the Russian Empire. He had gone to a Orthodox seminary school, and that Stalin's identity, Stalin's way of understanding himself, and Stalin's way of organizing was much more authentically Russian and Asian, Eurasian, than it was European, right? And while Trotsky and Lenin and all of them had been in exile, in exile, Stalin had been on the ground in Russia building the Bolshevik organization. Lenin and Bukharin and Zinoviev, they had been editors of Iskra, which was the theoretical journal of the Bolsheviks, in which they explained their ideas. It was secret. It was an illegal publication that was available only to party members. It was smuggled into the country. Stalin, on the other hand, was the editor of Pravda, which was the daily newspaper that was distributed everywhere in major cities in Russia. This daily newspaper, Truth, was what Pravda means. It just means truth. And it was this newspaper that was distributed that was highly agitational. It was directed at ordinary people. It was directed at factory workers. And almost every article was what they called worker correspondence, meaning that it was a letter written by somebody about the conditions that they faced in their factory. And Pravda was worker correspondence, and it was distributed everywhere. Stalin was the editor of the mass publication that people read, Pravda. Stalin was the mass organizer. Stalin was from a small village in Georgia. He was Country Joe. You ever hear of Country Joe and the Fish Band that played at Woodstock? They were named after Stalin and Mao. Country Joe and Mao, who said the revolutionaries are the fish and the masses are the water, right? That was Stalin. Stalin was very much a product of Eurasian civilization. He was very much a product of the Russian Orthodox Church, of the Russian peasantry, etc. And he was a mass organizer rather than being a revolutionary middle-class intellectual. And Stalin, as he builds up the Soviet Union and he industrializes the Soviet Union rapidly industrializes. It defeats the Nazis, but the Soviet Union changes over the course of Stalin's leadership. Abortion is outlawed. Homosexuality is outlawed. During the Second World War, they make a number of films that celebrate some of the great czars in Russian history, Alexander Nevsky and Ivan the Terrible, and that very much the Soviet Union that comes into existence is a synthesis of the very radical left-wing revolutionary Marxist ideas on the one hand, and the very conservative traditional Russian civilization that goes back thousands of years. And it's a synthesis of these two things. And that is very much what Russia becomes. And then we know that after the death of Stalin, Khrushchev gets up and gives his secret speech and accuses Stalin of being a brutal authoritarian, says that everything that was said about Stalin in the Western media was true. And at that point, there's a huge amount of demoralization inside the Soviet Communist Party. China eventually cuts its ties with the Soviet Union in response to Khrushchev and his secret speech. And many people in the Soviet Communist Party are demoralized. The Soviet Union gradually becomes less and less revolutionary. A clique of people at the top of the Soviet Union stop believing in communism and become entranced by the Western left. You have a new generation, the Gorbachevs and the Yeltsins, that move into Soviet communist leadership. And that they don't really believe in communism anymore. They want to be democratic socialists. They want to make, the Soviet Union into Norway or Sweden. They stop believing the West is imperialist, etc. And ultimately that leads to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. At the time that the Soviet Union fell, most of the Soviet communist leaders are convinced that somehow Russia will be able to just transition into being a welfare state like Norway or Sweden. And they are dead wrong. As soon as Yeltsin is in power, as soon as the Soviet Union is dissolved, the United States is in there economically wrecking the place, mass unemployment, mass hunger, selling off the state industries to the highest bidder. It's a disaster. It's a big defeat. But we also know that China, they have, well, let's go back to Russia. So we'll get to China in a second. So in Russia, you have this devastation that comes from the fall of the Soviet Union. The country is just economically looted and demolished. And in 1993, they elect a government that is called the National Salvation Coalition. It's Russian nationalists and the Communist Party. The Communist Party is the biggest part of the government. And they're going to stop the economic looting of the country. And so Boris Yeltsin forcibly dissolves the parliament. And there's an episode of violence. They call it Black September 1993. A lot of people are killed, and it's a disaster. 1996, they have an election, and that election is stolen. And the U.S. government, the Clinton administration, makes a documentary bragging about how they did everything they could to rig the elections, to make sure that Boris Yeltsin was reelected. And thank you, Dan. Super chats are always appreciated. To make sure that Boris Yeltsin is reelected, and that Zhuganov, the communist candidate, is not elected. And Russia is just economically devastated during the 1990s. But then we have a figure who comes to power named Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin is elected into office. Vladimir Putin comes out of the KGB. He comes out of the Russian security services. But he's elected on a platform that he's going to use oil and gas to stabilize Russia's economy. And so Putin comes into power, and he begins reasserting state control over the Russian economy and utilizing Gazprom and Rosneft, two state-controlled mega corporations, to stabilize Russia's economy. He rebuilds their industries. And by about 2006, Russia is fully restored economically. And Russia, once again, its industrial output is what it is. The wages of workers are rising significantly. Russia reboots itself after a decade of being economically looted and plundered. Putin is able to reboot Russia by reasserting state control. And Putin is not a communist, right? But the Communist Party is one of his biggest allies. And he admires the Soviet Union and their history defeating the Nazis, but he also admires some of the great Russian czars and figures. And he kind of mixes communism with the history of Russian civilization. And Putin very, very much takes Russia in an independent direction. So that's Russia. And then you have China. China, the communists take power in 1949. And at first, they're getting aid from the Soviet Union. And thank you, Mihach. I do appreciate it. They're getting aid from the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union is using that aid to kind of control them. They're dependent on aid from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's helping them build power plants. The Soviet Union's helping them build hospitals, etc. And in the first years that the Chinese Communist Party is in power, they do a lot of amazing things. They wipe out the heroin and drug addiction. They mobilize the population to fight against the heroin dealers, and they wipe out drug addiction. They wipe out venereal disease and the sex trade, and they liberate all kinds of people that have been kept as sex slaves in Shanghai and brothels. And they liberate people from that. And then they launch the Barefoot Doctors campaign. They send doctors all over the country, to go to the rural areas, and many millions of people in the countryside. The first time they ever see a doctor in their lives is when a communist barefoot doctor comes to their village. So they're doing great things, but in order to do it, they're getting aid from the Soviet Union. But then Stalin dies and Khrushchev comes to power. And Khrushchev denounces Stalin. And at first, China kind of embraces that. But then they see that Khrushchev is trying to accommodate with the United States, and that Khrushchev wants China to basically hold back building socialism. And he argues that China should just kind of remain what they call a people's democratic state. Well, Mao thinks that people around the world should struggle against U.S. imperialism. Mao also thinks that China can move toward being a socialist country. So China and the Soviet Union have a falling out, and they separate. It's called the Sino-Soviet split. And after the Sino-Soviet split, the Soviet Union is very harsh against China. They bring back all their doctors and all their engineers and all the people that were helping China to develop. And they don't give aid that was promised. Buildings are left half built, and it's a disaster. And so for the first 10 years, from about 1960 until about 1969, 1970, China decides that it's going to be ultra-communist. It's going to outdo the Soviet Union, right? And that they might be poorer than the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union is selling out, and they're going to be ultra-communist. And they launched the Great Leap Forward, which is an attempt to build a socialist industrial economy very rapidly. And it doesn't work out very well. It's actually kind of an economic disaster because they're trying to do things that they're just not within their capacity to do. And then they launched the Cultural Revolution to purge the Communist Party of people in the party that are deemed to be disloyal, and to, they mobilize the teenagers, the young people, to just go out and mobilize to bombard the headquarters and purge the Communist Party of anybody who is deemed to be not true and not sincere in their communist sentiments. But then after a certain period, it becomes clear that China needs foreign investment. And so you have first, the welcoming of Richard Nixon to China. Richard Nixon comes to China, and China pivots, even in the final years of Mao's life, toward aligning with the United States and Angola. Chinese aligned communists team up with the CIA to fight against the MPLA and the communist groups in Angola. And China denounces the Soviet Union's military intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And China, all over the world, China's friendly to Pinochet when he takes power in Chile because he's against the Soviet Union. And China starts aligning with the United States against the Soviet Union. And then after Mao dies, at that point, Deng Xiaoping gets even closer to the United States. And Deng Xiaoping starts enacting market reforms. And these market reforms are enacted. And they basically start utilizing foreign investment to build up their economy. And at the same time, all across Eastern Europe, you have the professionals, the skilled people, the doctors, the college professors, the engineers, the scientists. They're the people that are frustrated by the Soviet system because they feel stifled, they feel trapped. And they're the ones that get recruited to be counter-revolutionaries. But in China, the doctors and the scientists and the engineers, the Chinese Communist Party works really, really hard to win their trust. And a big focus of Deng Xiaoping and his reforms is emboldening the intellectuals and strengthening the intellectuals, letting these people start their own companies, letting them launch joint ventures with American companies. And while in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, the intellectuals, the skilled people become the base of counter-revolution, the Chinese Communist Party builds up the loyalty of the intellectuals and builds up the loyalty of this layer of people. So the Chinese Communist Party is moving in a different direction. And so the Chinese Communist Party is able to continue bringing in foreign investment while at the same time building up their own corporations. Now China has, at this point, the world's largest telecommunications corporation. It's called Huawei Technologies. And it's technically a profit-sharing, cooperative private company, but it's completely facilitated by the Chinese military and the Chinese government. And at this point, Huawei makes better phones than Apple does. China builds the fastest trains in the world, high-speed railway, because they see that in the West, the Western countries, their train technology is lagging. So the Chinese Communist Party launches the China Railway Corporation to build high-speed trains, and they're very good at building high-speed trains. China also builds the Three Gorges Dam, the world's largest hydroelectrical facility. And at this point, right, China builds itself up to being the second largest economy in the world. So in Eurasia, we have two countries that became industrial powers on the basis of communism. And in China, the communists are still in power, but they've kind of changed their beliefs, right? They're not communists of the Stalin era. They're definitely not communists of the Marx and Lenin era. They've adjusted. They call their ideology Marxist-Leninist ideology, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, and then three representations, or Jiang Zemin thought, or Jiang Zemin's three representations, and now Xi Jinping's thought for socialist construction. Right? They have their ideology that they've developed. Marxism is a big aspect of it, but it takes on different things. Now in China, during the Mao years, Mao tried to completely wipe out Confucius. Confucius is considered the father of Chinese civilization. But now in China, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, there's a revival of interest in Mao and communism. They're putting Mao's picture everywhere. They're distributing the Little Red Book, but they're also building statues of Confucius and putting Confucius everywhere. And Mao and Confucius walk hand in hand as part of what makes China a unique civilization that is not Western. The Western countries are not Confucian, and the Western countries are not communist and Maoist. Mao and Confucius walk hand in hand as part of what makes China a civilization of the land, unlike the civilization of the sea that is rising in, or is declining in the West, right? And then that accompanies what we see in the West. Let me see if I can find you a picture of this. This picture is very important, right? Let me see if I can find you a picture of this, because people don't believe it, but it exists. And I will say, to be fair, this is not universal. There are many people in Russia that are horrified by this, but it exists. It exists, and it would seem like something that could not be, but it exists. It absolutely does exist. And if I can find you the picture of it, the picture that I would like to show you, it's very important. But yeah, here we go. Here's one picture of it. I mean, it's not the picture that I was going to show, but it's the same thing, right? But you would say, oh, here's the picture I wanted to show. All right, this is the picture I wanted to show. How could this exist? What I'm about to put on the screen, right? This seems like a total contradiction. But it's not. And many people in Russia are horrified by this. So this doesn't represent all of Russia. I have to say that. But it exists. Like, there's many Russian communists that think this is an abomination. There's many Russian Orthodox people that think it's an abomination, but it exists. Look at this. This is a woman who is a Russian Orthodox believer, and she has an icon, a Russian Orthodox icon of Stalin. Now, how can this exist? The Russian Orthodox Church was very much opposed to communism in the Soviet Union. And Stalin was an atheist, and the Bolsheviks destroyed many churches and killed many priests. So how can this exist? Well, it's an understanding that Stalin and the Russian Orthodox Church are both part of Russia's unique identity that is not Western, that makes them a civilization of the land, not a civilization of the sea, right? That the Russian Orthodox Church and the civilization that goes back thousands of years, and Joseph Stalin, who carried out Lenin's vision of building Soviet power plus electrification, building Russia into a modern country that could defeat the foreign invaders. Stalin, who killed Trotsky, who was very much an adherent of the Western Marxism, right? When Dugin talks about Russia as an example of the tyrannic civilization of the land-based empires, that's what he's talking about, right? And what we have rising in Eurasia, in Russia and China, and you can also put the Islamic Revolution of Iran into this category. You can put the Houthis into this category, right? We have a new kind of civilization that's been around for thousands of years. We have civilization of the land rising as civilization of the sea is collapsing. And that is why I maintain that the future of humanity is in Eurasia, right? That the Western capitalist system that has this built-in problem of overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profit, or value crisis, as Peter Coffin calls it, and the Eastern countries that have a socialist economic system based on rational planning and control of the means of production, and also don't have a liberal worldview. They're much less individualistic and much more collectivist in how they view things. That these two civilizations are once again clashing. And the future of humanity is on the Eurasian world island, right? The future of humanity is on the Eurasian world island. That is what I maintain, and that is why Eurasia is the future. And this is what you need to understand. But now I have to end my remarks by talking about why this matters. Why does this matter to us, right? I mean, you could interpret what I just said, everything that I just said, as saying it's hopeless here in America. Russia and China are rising. The USA, Britain, France, Germany, we're sinking, and they're gonna rise, and we're gonna fall, and that's the end of it. Bullshit. Bullshit. I would disagree with that because of this. Right? And this is an important moment in the history of our country. And I'm going to put this image on the screen. Right? This was an important moment in the history of our country. Was this. This is very key in how America was founded. What is that? That's the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party. And what was it about? The British had pulled their bullshit, and they were forcing us to accept their corporations. They were refusing to allow the Americans to set up their own corporations. And so what did the American settlers do? They went to the harbors and they took all the British tea and they dumped it into the ocean. The Boston Tea Party. And that was a rejection of the British forced monopoly and the British Atlanticist civilization of the sea, because the settlers of America wanted to develop the United States. They did not want the United States to just be a trading outpost. The British wanted the United States to just be a trading hub in their global empire. The settlers, for a variety of reasons, some of them, I mean, many of them, wanted to plunder the Native Americans. Some of them were slave owners in the South. But regardless, they wanted to industrialize the United States. They wanted a civilization on the land. They wanted the economic development of the United States. They did not want the United States to simply be an extension of the British Empire, right? They wanted an industrialized civilization on the American heartland, on the American mainland. That was the question in the 1776 revolution. But then that brings me to another painting, right? And this is a much more important painting. This is a painting that you will find in the Kansas State Capitol building. If you ever go to Kansas, go to the State Capitol building, and you will see a very, very important painting that was put there during the Roosevelt administration, at a time when the United States was getting friendly to the Soviet Union as an ally to defeat the Nazis, when we had a President Roosevelt that was a populist reformer, an ally of labor unions. He hired millions of unemployed people, and they built post offices and schools, and he hired lots of unemployed painters to paint paintings. And one of the painters that Roosevelt hired painted a mural for the Kansas State Capitol building. And this is what he painted. He painted John Brown. John Brown was the figure who was the symbol of the struggle to defeat slavery in America. John Brown was a religious fanatic, a farmer, a rural guy who was very, very opposed to slavery, and was so dedicated to opposing slavery that first he and his sons went to Kansas because they were going to take a vote in Kansas over whether it would be a slave state or whether it would be a free state. And John Brown did not want Kansas to be a slave state. So he and his sons and his band of abolitionists, they went and had shootouts and armed battles with the pro-slavery militias and the pro-slavery groups in Kansas. And then John Brown went up to Canada with his brothers, his sons and his brothers, and he went up to Canada, and then he formed his own group, and they went to Virginia, to Harper's Ferry, and they tried to seize the armory at Harper's Ferry and launch an armed uprising against slavery. And John Brown received the death penalty. He was the first American to ever be executed for treason because he tried to launch an armed uprising against slavery. He wanted to organize the small farmers, the factory workers, and the slaves of the South into a revolutionary army to smash the slaveocracy, right? And this painting is in the Kansas State Capitol building. Why? Because the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln started in Iowa and in Kansas and in other states where the small farmers, the free soilers they were called, who were opposed to slavery, wanted to form a new party that would defeat the power of the slaveholders and Wall Street. Wall Street began as an insurance center that insured slave ships. And in the South, in the U.S. South, they actually had a ban on textile looms. And the Southern government, the Confederacy that eventually emerged, was against technological development. They wanted to hold back industrialization. They wanted the South to remain a primitive agrarian economy that would grow cotton for the British Empire. And they made it illegal to have a loom, to have a modern loom, because that would cut into the British textile looms. They wanted the British Empire to maintain its monopoly on the textile industry. So you have a civilization emerging and the struggle to defeat slavery and the American Revolution. If you look at the root of both of those revolutions, what they are is an uprising that is about creating a civilization of the land in America. And that the entire history of the United States has been a battle over the question of, will we be a civilization of the land or will we be a civilization of the sea? And that is the question facing American civilization. Abraham Lincoln, John Brown, Franklin Roosevelt, Alexander Hamilton, they wanted us to be a civilization of the land. Whereas the Woodrow Wilson administration, especially the neoconservatives and the neocons, they want us to be a civilization of the sea. And what has happened in the United States since the 1970s is that we have transitioned at full speed into becoming a civilization of the sea, right? At this point, the industrial base, the industrial heartland of the United States has been almost completely eroded. Detroit is not Motor City any longer. Pittsburgh, their football team might be the Pittsburgh Steelers, but they ain't making very much steel in Pittsburgh. At this point, Gary, Indiana is closed down. It still smells awful, but Gary, Indiana is no longer an industrial center. The heartland of the United States has been completely hollowed out and is bleeding. Wisconsin, Minneapolis, Texas, Alabama, all these once prosperous economic centers of the United States have been hollowed out. And the United States is turning into New York City and Los Angeles. Now there's more, it's gradually turning into that, but we're becoming a coastal civilization because Wall Street, New York is the center of the financial system of the world, and Los Angeles and Silicon Valley are the center of the information revolution and the propaganda industry of the world, Hollywood and television and YouTube and social media. And we are becoming a New York, California civilization. However, the overwhelming majority of the American people do not live in New York City and do not live in Southern California. And the vast heartland of America has lots of coal and lots of timber and lots of natural gas and lots of oil. And it's also got millions of people in it. And right now, there is a battle that will soon be breaking out. Will we be a civilization of the sea or a civilization of the land? And ultimately, the United States has the capacity to become a civilization of the land. And as the world moves toward multipolarity, I believe that the United States can be reborn as a civilization of the land that is cooperating with Russia and China. When Earl Browder, the leader of the Communist Party, was running for president in 1940, he called for creating a Washington, Moscow, Beijing axis in the world that would oppose both Nazi Germany and the British Empire. And I think multipolarity is the future of the world. But in order for the United States to flourish in a multipolar world, the land civilization, what you can call the continentalist side of American history, must assert itself. We need the Roosevelt, John Brown, Alexander Hamilton side of American history to rise up and defeat the neocons and to defeat the British Empire and the Eastern establishment. And ultimately, there is a battle for America's identity. And it will come in the form of a battle between capitalism and socialism, I believe. But it will be a different kind of socialism because woke socialism is Trotskyism. Woke socialism is socialism of the sea. However, Stalinism and Maoism, those are socialisms of the land, socialism of the East, right? Stalinism is socialism with Russian characteristics. Maoism is socialism with Chinese characteristics. And ultimately, it won't be woke socialism that will put the United States into the emerging world economy. It will be a non-woke socialism. It'll be a socialism with American characteristics that draws from Lincoln and Roosevelt in the same way that Stalin and Putin draw from Catherine the Great and from Peter the Great and from Ivan the Terrible, in the same way that Xi Jinping draws from Mao and draws from Confucius, right? We ultimately will develop a socialism that draws from John Brown, that draws from Abraham Lincoln, that draws from Alexander Hamilton, that draws from Harriet Tubman, that draws from Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And we will ultimately develop a socialism with American characteristics that will rise up and force the United States to become part of the emerging multipolar land-based civilization that is rising in the world today. And that is what I maintain. And that is why Eurasia is the future, but America can be part of that future. However, it will require an epic battle to take place. There will be a fight. American society will have to reject the dying civilization of the sea. It will have to reject capitalism in its monopoly stage. And there will have to be an uprising of the people of the land, because that is what we are, right? We're going to have to see a revival of people who look like this. There's going to have to be a lot of people like this across America. Wild-eyed fanatics who believe in right and wrong, who believe in the right to bear arms, who are committed to fighting for what's right and fighting for truth. And we're going to have to see a revival of the people of the land spirit that lies within the American civilization. And that is ultimately what is going to turn the United States around. There needs to be a spiritual revolution. There needs to be an economic revolution, and there ultimately needs to be a political revolution, right? And that will then adjust us to the technological revolution that is taking place that makes civilization of the sea unsustainable. The information revolution and the technological advancement have made capitalism an outmoded system. So ultimately, the spiritual revolution, the economic revolution, and the political revolution that are coming will be a rejection of the dying civilization of the land and a rejection of liberalism by the American people and the assertion of a land-based civilization. And the North America, as we know it, will become a continental civilization like Russia and like China. And that is what I maintain needs to happen. That is my thesis about what is going on, why Western imperialism is dying, why Eurasia is the future, and why we can be hopeful here in the United States as we focus on building a civilization of the land. And those are my opening remarks for tonight. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. I hope you all enjoyed that. And now we will do our roll call. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations, names and locations. Who's with us? All right, we got Mark Jones in Utica, New York. Very good. Very good. We got Bob in Troy, New York. Rice from Adelaide, Australia. Dan Keating from New Jersey. We got Conrad in Poland. Alex in Oregon. We got Dave in Savannah, Georgia. We got Seasoned Noob in China. We got Muzzle Paint in Maryland. We got Alexander Adrason in Waterloo, Iowa. Boris in Illinois. Tybee in Pennsylvania. We got Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati. We got Luca in Singapore, Ed in Louisville, West Coast, Gary Sullivan, Enoch in Australia, Florida Man City. We got Scott McLaughlin in Washington, D.C. We got Ian Whitehorse in the Yukon. We got Emperor Penguin in Texas. We got Minden out of Midwest, Olympia Logic. We got Mariah in North Carolina. Thank you. I'm glad you liked it. We got Quebec to Los Angeles County, Nico. We got Bard from British Columbia. We got Loving It in Oakland. We got Christine in Colorado. We got Zach Brunch in Richmond, Virginia. We got Jonathan in North Carolina. We got Ahmed Hashi. We got Moonlight Beach, California. We got Megan in Kansas City, Missouri. We got Mihutch in the Republic of Texas. We got Southwest Florida. We got Colin in Greensboro, Emmett in Dallas, John McCarthy in Chicago. Welcome, everybody. If David Fox from Australia is watching, I'm wearing your shirt. This is a shirt David Fox sent me. Proud to be union. It's for his union that he sent me. So I've got David Fox's shirt on. Very good. If you're watching, David. Donnie Wallace in North Carolina. Charlie in Green Bay. That's in Wisconsin. We got Island. We got an island. Very good. We got Mohsen from Iran. Very, very good. We got Emmett in Dallas. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. We got Andrew Walter in Argentina. Welcome, Andrew. We got Balu in India. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So I would encourage people to join the Center for Political Innovation because we've got some very exciting projects coming up. July 7th, we're having a rally in Washington, D.C. That's our next big thing, a rally to defend working families, oppose war and empire. It's going to be a great rally against the NATO summit. And we've got a lot of great projects in the works. We got Isabel in Toronto. Welcome. So I would encourage you to join the Center for Political Innovation. So now I do have 6 super chats to answer, and I do thank those who sent them in. I don't see any Rumble rants that have come in. But before I put them on, I'm going to put on some of my favorite Beethoven music. This is my favorite piece by Beethoven. It's called the Shepherd's Song. And this is part of Beethoven's 6th Symphony, which he dedicated to the peasantry. And it was at the time in Europe that the peasants of Europe were rising up against feudalism. So Beethoven wrote this symphony dedicated to the peasantry. And the climax of the symphony is a very triumphant song called the Shepherd's Song. And the Shepherd's Song is it's called the Shepherd's Hymn. And it is a triumphant song of the optimistic peasantry fighting for equality, fighting for a brave new world. So I'm going to put that on, and then I will answer the super chat questions, and then we will conclude. So if you have anything else you would like me to answer in the second half of our show, send me a Rumble rant, send me a Rockfin, or there is no Rockfin tip. I'm not on Rockfin. Send me a super chat. We got, 6 super chats to answer. I think 2 of them don't have any questions. So if you want me to answer a question or respond to something in the second half of our show, by all means, send a super chat. Get me talking. I am now going to put on the Beethoven, Shepherd's Hymn. We're going to put it on. So hold on. Going to fast forward to where the Shepherd's Hymn begins. All righty, here we go. So there you go. There you go. It was a little long, but I needed a break for my throat dealing with those allergies, and it's a beautiful piece of music. It's really my favorite of the Beethoven pieces. It really kind of expresses the optimism of the revolutionary peasantry of the rural areas. So I find that to be really Beethoven's greatest piece. So thank you all for sticking around. So now I'm going to start answering people's super chat questions. There are 6 super chats that came in, but I do want to remind people that super chats are very important, not only because they, help me, they give me something to talk about in the second half of the show. They also support me. They also, I'm living in New York City where the rent is too damn high, and I'm living here in New York City. Got to pay my bills, and in order to do that, in order to pay my bills and have this extra room where I can do this home studio, I need to be able to have you all's support. So if you send a super chat, you're not only giving me things to think about, you are also helping support me, and your support is appreciated. Now, if you join the Center for Political Innovation, I have no access to that money. There was some stupid innuendo before, and so because of that, I make sure to have no access to the money of CPI, so no one can say anything. I do not have access to CPI's funds. If you pay dues as a CPI member or you donate to CPI, that's great. It helps CPI do stuff, but I have no access to those funds, just so there's no innuendo. You can also support me, though, by purchasing the books that I've written, right? They're available on Amazon. We got this, Who Are the Houthis? What Are They Fighting For? This is our book about the Houthis. I've written other books. We got our new textbook that's out there, etc. Yeah, if you can send super chats, give me something to talk about. That helps support this channel as well. And we always could use the support because, it is ridiculously expensive to live where I have to live because of my job and to maintain this extra room. So your support is always appreciated. I don't want to sound like NPR or PBS. I don't want to be on here, stopping every 2 minutes. But there you go. So now I'm going to start answering people's questions. If you got any more questions, send them my way. First question. John McCarthy says that Tara Reid shouted me out during her interview with Cynthia McKinney. That's great. Cynthia McKinney was on this channel. Tara Reid has been on this channel many times. I saw her when I was in Russia. So now I think, if possible, if I can find the transcript, we'll just find that, right? We'll see if we can just pull that up. I am curious about this, right? Tara Reid has a YouTube channel, and I hate, one thing I can't stand is the the YouTube search mechanism. I type in Tara Reid and I don't find Tara Reid, and it's very annoying, right? Tara Reid has her YouTube channel, but I type in Tara Reid into the YouTube search engine and I don't find her YouTube channel. It's very, very annoying, but we will find this interview because we love Cynthia McKinney, a great friend of our show. Great to have her on here. She did a great chat. And we also love Tara Reid. She's a hero. So I found the link to the interview. All right, let's see if I can look in the transcript to get the time code. All right, we'll start downloading that interview. We're not going to show the whole thing. But since John sent a super chat about that, I'm curious to hear what she had to say. Yeah, the transcript is available. Very good. So I'm looking for the time code, and we'll see what she had to say about us, right? All right. Okay. Very good. All right. So we have the time code of where she said it. All right. So we're downloading the interview, and it's downloading, and we'll put that on the screen. So yeah, the interview is downloading, and then we will just listen to what was said about me. So there we go. I'm curious to hear it, and might as well put it on the screen. So thank you for the heads up. And while we're waiting for it to download, we will answer some of the other super chats that have come in. All right. The next one is tomorrow is Orthodox Easter, and Putin just attended services at the Moscow Cathedral. That is very interesting. Russia, at this point, the Russian Orthodox Church is very much part of what they were about, right? The Russian Orthodox Church was originally outlawed by the Bolsheviks as a counter-revolutionary organization. It was re-legalized during the Second World War. Khrushchev then cracked down on it after Stalin's death. But then during the Brezhnev years, it started to flourish. And then in the final years of the USSR, it became much more popular. Reverend Billy Graham. I don't know if people know about this. I wonder if I could find video of this. Reverend Billy Graham visited the Soviet Union in the final years in the 80s, right? And he gave interviews about it where he said that they were not persecuting Christians, and that was a really big deal. And Billy Graham was actually forced to apologize for that, because it was such a big deal that he was going there and saying, look, they're not persecuting Christians, and that he said there were more people attending the church where he gave his sermon, the Russian Orthodox Church, where he was invited as an American guest pastor. There were more people attending that church than there were at his home church in North Carolina. And that was just completely unacceptable, to the mainstream media. So he had to come out and apologize and say, oh no, persecution is happening. And it was an interesting incident. It was 1984 that this happened, that Billy Graham, was forced to apologize for saying that Christians were not being persecuted in the USSR, which I think is hilarious. And it goes to show you how politicized our media is. Billy Graham was an advisor to Richard Nixon. He was a conservative, an arch conservative his entire life, but it did not matter. Now, one thing that's also interesting is there is audio tape of Billy Graham and Richard Nixon talking about the Israel lobby and the power of the Israel lobby in, let me say, less than politically correct terms, which is also interesting. So Billy Graham, despite being part of the American political establishment, being an anti-communist, being pro-imperialist, he was a bit more honest. He went to the USSR. They weren't persecuting Christians. He said so. And the Israel lobby has a lot of power in the United States. And he said so. And he had no problem. He and Richard Nixon had a frank conversation. So first, I'm going to put on, this is Billy Graham. I've never seen this before. I just remember the incident. This is Billy Graham preaching in the USSR. So we're gonna put Billy Graham preaching in the USSR. It's like a 3-minute clip. I'm curious to see what he had to say. This is Billy Graham preaching in the Soviet Union.
Last September, it was my privilege to be invited along with members of our team to preach in several major cities of the Soviet Union, from the Baltic Sea to the heart of Siberia. The invitation came from the largest Christian body in the USSR, the Russian Orthodox Church, and also from the second major group, the All-Union Council of Evangelical Christians, Baptist. In each city, I preached in both Russian Orthodox cathedrals and Baptist churches, and in addition, I had a number of other speaking opportunities, over 50 altogether. It was an unforgettable opportunity and experience. We found crowded churches and great openness to the gospel wherever we went. There were no restrictions on what I could say. I preached exactly the same sermons there that I preach here. We were permitted to take our own television crew with us, and they were able to film some aspects of Soviet religious and social life, which have seldom been seen in the West. My primary purpose in going to the Soviet Union, of course, was to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, just as I've done in many other countries all over the world. For many years I had prayed that God would open the door, if it was His will, for me to preach in the Soviet Union. I first visited Moscow as a tourist in 1959, and vividly remember praying with my associate Grady Wilson in the giant Lenin Stadium that God would someday open the door. In 1982, I was an observer and speaker at an international conference on peace made up of religious leaders held in Moscow under the sponsorship of Patriarch Pimen of the Russian Orthodox Church. I knew that I would be misunderstood and criticized. I would be accused of being used by Soviet propaganda. But the more I prayed and thought about it, the more I became convinced that God wanted me to go because we were certain that it would open future doors for proclaiming the gospel not only in the Soviet Union, but throughout the Eastern world. I also turned to the Scriptures. The Holy Spirit brought to my mind that Jesus commanded his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel, not just in capitalistic countries or countries which are similar to ours. I also wanted to become better acquainted with the situation of Christians in the Soviet Union, which I think is often misunderstood by Americans. As is well known, of course, the Soviet system has an atheistic ideology, and at times religious believers have faced great difficulties and even persecution. And while there, I talked frankly with church and state officials about such issues as human rights and religious liberty, the printing of Bibles, for example, and restrictions on religious believers. I also expressed directly to Soviet officials the concerns that many people in the West have about these issues and the difficulties they cause for better international relations. At this dangerous hour of history, I also prayed that perhaps in some way unknown to me at that time, that God would use us in bringing a better understanding between our two countries.
That was very interesting. And that's a great question, Olympia Logic, to follow up with. But before we do that, it took me digging. Now, it was interesting. I wanted to just find the conversation raw. I didn't want to find some news report highlighting it. This is it's described as an anti-Semitic conversation between Billy Graham and Richard Nixon in 1972. So let's see what this is.
We like it or not, everybody thinks of you as conservative, and then when you lean a little bit in that direction toward the sociological thing is the big thing. What's that?
It's all right to lean in that direction on.
You have to, or the whole thing will be closed to you. You know, I mean, I don't care how conservative. I'm sure I'm more conservative than you are. At least you told me that one time, and I think that's true. But I have to lean a little bit. You know, I go and I keep friends with Mr. Rosenthal at the New York Times and people of that sort, you know. And not all the Jews, but a lot of the Jews are great friends of mine. They swarm around me and they're friendly to me because they know that I'm friendly to Israel. But they don't know how I really feel about what they're doing to this country. And I have no power, no way to handle them. But I would stand up if you know, under proper circumstances.
Wow. I was waiting for the part where he said something anti-Semitic, and damn. Okay. And there's another one too. I think this is another Richard Nixon conversation with Billy Graham, where Billy Graham goes off about Jewish people. It's interesting what is said behind closed doors. I mean, Richard Nixon was a bigot in many, many ways, and it sounds like Billy Graham was also, but they were also probably alluding to the power of the Israel lobby. They were just, anti-Semitic. They didn't see a need to separate Jewish people from the crimes of Israel, and they realized that Israel had a lot of power. This is another one. All right. This is another conversation behind closed doors between Reverend Billy Graham and Richard Nixon.
You see, the Bible makes a distinction, Mr. President, between two groups of Jews. One is called the synagogue of Satan. There are two different kinds. And those people, in the latter days, it's called the remnant of God's people, which will be Jewish people. And then there's the synagogue of Satan. And nearly all of your religious deceptions in the latter days, what the Bible speaks, latter days could be 1,000 years, what they call the synagogue of Satan. In other words, they are energized by a supernatural power called the devil. This is what the Bible teaches, whether you believe it or don't believe it. This is the biblical teaching, and this is what I believe. And I believe that they have a strange brilliance about them. they're smart, and they are energized, in my judgment, by a supernatural power.
Well, also they do something else. They're not smart.
And you see, of course, Hitler didn't. They had a stranglehold on Germany, on the banking of Germany, on everything in Germany, and the media. They had the whole thing, you see. But he went about it wrong. But this stranglehold has got to be broken, or this country is going to go down the drain.
You believe that?
Yes, sir.
I can't ever say it.
Holy shit. That's just blatant anti-Semitism. I mean, that's just holy shit. Yuck. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's not about the Israel lobby. That's anti-Semitism. Holy shit. Yuck. Anyway, don't know if it was wise of me to play that on here. That's what Richard Nixon and Billy Graham said about the Jews behind closed doors. Not pleasant, and certainly not respectable. Wow. Yeah, holy shit is right. Jesus Christ, what did I just listen to? Hitler went about it wrong. Wow. Okay. That's one way to put it. Shit, wow. But anyway, there you go. But anyhow, so let's move on to the next question. Take the Marx quote and change England to America and Ireland to Palestine, and it'll be 1,000% relevant today. So let's do that. Let's just put the quote on the screen. We'll just put the quote on the screen. All right, so here we go. Okay. So we're replacing England with America and Ireland to Palestine. So Palestine is the bulwark of the American landed aristocracy. The exploitation of that country is not only the main source of their material wealth, it represents their great moral strength. They, in fact, represent the domination over Palestine. Palestine is therefore the cardinal means by which the American aristocracy maintain their domination over America itself. Thus, to hasten social revolution in America, it is most important object of the International Working Men's Association. The sole means of doing so is to make Palestine independent. It is therefore the task of the International to bring the conflict between America and Palestine to the forefront everywhere and to take the side of Palestine everywhere. The special task of the Central Council in London is to awaken the consciousness of the American working class for them that the national emancipation of Palestine is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation. That works for me, right? I mean, we're at a point where Zionism is so integral in imperialism, right? That, I mean, at this point, Israel and the United States, Israel and U.S. imperialism, Israel and British imperialism are completely merged together. I think that makes perfect sense. So, and that, yes, the liberation of the Palestinians, and that's that last line. That's why I like this statement in particular. It's not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation. Supporting people in the colonized world fighting for their national liberation is not about being a bleeding heart. And it's not about thinking, you just feel so sorry for these people being oppressed. It's that it's awakening to fight our own oppressors over here. It's recognizing that we have a common enemy, that our real enemy is at home, right? And that we should be fighting Wall Street and the Pentagon, not fighting people in the colonized world. And the people in the colonized world are fighting the same enemy and have the same ultimate liberation and that we have. That's what it means. So there we go. All righty. There we go. All righty. Next, Dan Keating. Thank you very much for the super chat. Much appreciated. Me Hutch, thank you very much for the super chat. Much appreciated. John McCarthy says Thursday is Victory Day. May 9th is Victory Day, the victory over fascism. It's an important day. The victory, the defeat of the Nazis, the VE Day, I think, victory in Europe. It's a great, important day. And I know that there was a parade today in New York City. I didn't get the location until the very last minute, so I couldn't go. But I know that there's going to be events around the country in different places. I know some of our comrades are going to those events, and they're going to give a great report from those events. So I'm looking forward to hearing that. There's going to be a huge parade in Russia. There's going to be a lot of ceremonies in Russia, given the circumstances. Victory Day is going to be very, very important this year in Russia. So there you go. Very important. All righty. The vernacular that people are used to using is incorrect. Observing derivation etymology is key to seeing what's actually occurring. I'm not quite sure what you're referring to there, but the use of words changes over time. There's a name for that. Words have their meaning, their literal meaning, but then there's an association. I can't remember what it's called, but a word, giddy. Right? If I said giddy, what does giddy mean? It means happy. But if I say happy, and if I said giddy, it means two different things. Giddy kind of means like inappropriately happy, or it's like an awkward word for happy. But happy just means happy, right? And so, if you translate something and you say giddy rather than happy, it has a different connotation, right? And that's something that's important to remember. And those connotations of words change over time, right? Giddy and happy mean the same thing. But at least in our time, giddy is kind of a weird happy. It's a happy that's like, why are you so giddy? Why are you so happy about this? Right? It's uncomfortable. But it may be in the future, giddy would not be, right? Who knows? I don't know the origin of the word giddy, but, and that's an aspect of language that it makes it very hard for people that are speaking a language that is not their native language, because they don't catch up on. There's a name for that. I cannot remember what that is, but it's the association, the popular association with words, where words have their literal meaning and then they have their association. And that can be very, very difficult. Yeah, giddy suggests exaggerated. Gay literally means happy. Well, that's a different meaning. It's not a different connotation. But there we go. There we go. All righty. Did the Russian Orthodox Church help undermine and dissolve the USSR? Probably. But it's such a big institution. There were different wings of it. And it's also important to note that at the time of the fall of the USSR, and this is interesting, there was and I've talked about this a lot, there was a big divide in the Soviet bureaucracy between the reformist camp that was basically shedding Marxism and becoming European social democrats and synthetic leftists, right? They were turning into hippies, basically. They were shedding Marxism. They were in awe of Western rock and roll music and Western consumerism. And they were becoming just kind of like Western liberals. That was Yeltsin. That was Gorbachev. And then you had this other wing that they called the hardliners. And the hardliners, they were generally referred to in U.S. media as Stalinists. But many of them were also converting to being Russian Orthodox, but they were fitting their Russian Orthodox conservatism in with Russian nationalism. They were becoming conservative and anti-imperialist, right? And that's, it's funny because the term National Bolshevik, that was in the 1990s. There was a political party called the National Bolshevik Party. But in the 1980s, there's a picture of the LaRouche organization. They're protesting NBC, and they call it the National Bolshevik Corporation. And if you read Limits to Growth, or if you read There Is No Limit to Growth by Lyndon LaRouche, he spends a lot of time talking about the National Bolsheviks, and he's referring to this hardliner wing of the Russian Communist Party that are not the reformists. They're not becoming westernized, but they're hardliners, meaning they want to stick to the Soviet Union. They want to stick to socialism, but they're starting to fit it in with Orthodox nationalism. And this was a problem with the Soviet Communist Party. It was, the Soviet Communist Party, there was no public debate. Every statement, everything that was passed was unanimous. All the debate happened behind closed doors. It was a very closed system, right? And so because it was a very closed system, because of that, it was very much the disagreements were beneath the surface, and officially everything was done in terms of Marxism, Leninism, but it was very surface level. Soviet television, Soviet political statements were very shallow, but people who were digging deeper into politics, they were going outside of Marxism. And so the hardliners who dug deeper into politics were becoming orthodox nationalists. So there probably was a very orthodox wing of the hardliner camp too. I think there were obviously some Orthodox Christians that were westernized, that thought the USSR and communism was evil because it was anti-Christian, thought America was great. But there were also Orthodox hardliners, right? And I think, if I understand correctly, Russian President Vladimir Putin, he was in the KGB and he was associating with the Orthodox hardliners that were emerging. If I remember correctly, I don't know that history well enough, honestly, but my understanding is that Putin comes out of the wing of the KGB, the wing of the Soviet Communist Party, that were becoming Orthodox hardliners that were opposed to the fall of the dissolution of the USSR. That were they were moving away from Marxism, but they were drifting in a like Russian nationalist and Orthodox direction rather than a reformist and liberal direction. So the question was, did the Russian Orthodox Church help undermine and dissolve the USSR? Probably some wings of it, a very big chunk of it did, but there was also probably a hardliner wing of it that did not, that fought against the dissolving of the USSR. The answer is yes and no. That especially, and that's the one thing, right? When you have small Protestant churches, the church can be politically aligned with the Democrats, politically aligned with the Republicans, right? I guess they're technically not supposed to do that in the United States. They'll lose their tax exempt status or whatever. But, small churches can be pretty solidly in one camp. But like, what side is the Catholic Church on? Right? Biden is Roman Catholic. He's a Democrat. John F. Kennedy is the only other Catholic president we've had. He's a Democrat. But there were some Roman Catholic bishops who said Biden couldn't get communion because he believed in abortion and abortion being legal. And there's a very conservative Republican wing of the Catholic Church that really hates Biden and really likes Trump, right? And I believe Amy Coney Barrett, she's technically not Catholic. She's technically Catholic, but she's part of a parachurch organization that's Pentecostal. It's called People of Praise. She's not really Catholic. She's an evangelical, but she's part of like an evangelical infiltration of the Catholic Church called People of Praise, which is what they call a parachurch organization. But the more recent U.S. Supreme Court justice, the man, what is his name? The more recent Supreme Court justice, that guy's actually Catholic. But he's a conservative. He's a Republican. He's very much a conservative, very much a Republican. And what side is the Catholic Church on? The Catholic Church is such a vast institution, Brett Kavanaugh, that there's many, many different wings of the Catholic Church that have many different political alliances, etc. And the Russian Orthodox Church, again, is such a big institution. Right. You do have, I think the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church is Patriarch Kirill of Moscow. He's like the official leader of the Russian Orthodox Church. Is that his name? Patriarch Kirill. Let me look that up. I want to get it right. Patriarch Kirill of Moscow. Right. Yeah. Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, or Cyril, right? Cyril or Kirill, right, is the Russian Orthodox bishop. He's like the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, but I think there are probably many different wings of the Russian Orthodox Church that have different positions. So, I don't think you can say that, necessarily that, the whole institution did that, but probably a very big chunk of it did. And, a lot of the opposition to the Soviet Union was framed in terms of religion, right? There's no question about that. All right. By fact, Medicare offices share the same building as for-profit healthcare. As long as they have a different address and tax ID, it's legal. That's interesting, right? And I know that, that very much, I mean, people think Obamacare is communism. Obamacare is a private healthcare system. It's just, it's just facilitated. There's like government facilitation of private healthcare. There's a mandate. We have to buy private healthcare. And that, I mean, HMOs, health insurance companies, are licensed by the state. It was Richard Nixon who created the HMO system. HMOs are licensed by the government, right? Governments have to facilitate HMOs, but they are private for-profit institutions that carry out health insurance. And that the state is heavily involved in facilitating the private healthcare system of the United States. And that's why it's so expensive. And this is one point that people that advocate socialized medicine, and shout out to Megan, by the way, she's very active. She does great work with the People's Party. Great to talk to you, Megan. Glad you're on here. But, one thing that is pointed out by advocates of socialized medicine is that the government is already heavily involved in healthcare in America. But the way our private medicine system is set up, healthcare overall costs way more, right? As a public, we spend way more on healthcare, right? If it was in the hands of the state, it would cost about 10 times less. And yes, it would come out of our tax money, but overall, about 10 times less money would be spent on it. And that's a really important point to make, right? That the way our private healthcare system is set up, it's very wasteful. It is a cash cow for a lot of corporations. And I mean, it's not just a profit margin. It's ridiculous, right? Healthcare in America is a ripoff. The insurance companies rip you off. The providers rip you off. The drug companies rip you off. It is a ripoff in so many ways. And then if we had a national healthcare system, it would cost about 10% as much. And that the government is involved in our healthcare system. They're just involved in making sure that it's a money-making operation for a lot of big pharma corporations and a lot of health insurance giants. And our healthcare system is just a great example of the public being milked for money. People talk about the FDA and its cozy relationship with drug manufacturers. People talk about, Medicare and its cozy relationship with the private insurance companies. And it's ridiculous. And that overall we're being robbed, and the government is part of it, right? It's not a private healthcare system. It's a for-profit healthcare system in which the government is very heavily involved in helping the U.S. public to get ripped off and spend astronomically larger amounts on healthcare than is necessary. And that's a point that people in the socialized or Medicare for all movement point out a lot. And it should be a source of outrage. And that, people get very worked up and angry, people who just, there's a lot of people that just know that socialized medicine or whatever is just the bad thing. And there were a lot of TV specials in the 90s convincing us that, people were dying in the waiting rooms in Canada or dying in the waiting rooms in Britain and stuff. And that was all that wasn't true. And we all got sold a bill of goods. I mean, the healthcare in the United States, every other industrial country in the world has free healthcare. Now, some of them, like Canada, they have the Medicare for all system. It's called single payer, where there's one insurance company and it's the government. In Britain, they have a national health service where the hospitals are nationalized or like state property. Doctors are government employees. But every other industrial country in the world has free healthcare. It used to be that it was every other industrial country in the world except for South Africa. The apartheid government of South Africa had a private healthcare system. But after Nelson Mandela came in, they adopted a national healthcare system as well. So, it used to be the United States and apartheid South Africa, and now it's the United States. And it's ridiculous. And that's why I disagree with libertarians. Libertarians have it in their head that, that if we just privatized everything, it would be better. If privatizing things was the answer, the USA would be a paradise because we have schools for profit, charter schools. We have a for-profit healthcare system, right? We've privatized our military contractors. We even have prisons for profit. We have been adopting the free market, Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand, privatize everything. It's always better when a private company that's making a profit runs things. We've been doing that in the United States for 50, 60 years now. We've been taking services that are generally run by the state and handing them over to private corporations. And it has been a disaster. And we have gotten poorer and poorer and poorer as a country. I mean, and there's a big effort. They continue to try and privatize the post office. The post office is in the U.S. Constitution, but there's a big effort to defund the post office. There's a big effort to replace things that are done at the post office with done by FedEx or done, excuse me, I'm running out of energy, folks. I'm at the end of my rope, but there's a big effort to continue to privatize our services. And again, if that was going to make things better, it would have done it by now. So I think I've made my point. This was a great night. I think I gave a strong presentation tonight. You all asked some good questions and some great super chats, etc. So thank you all for everything you've done. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Join the Center for Political Innovation. Become part of our movement. Mark your calendar for July 7th. There was a petition earlier about healthcare. Let me put that petition on one more time that our friend Phil, who just joined the Center for Political Innovation, he has this petition about healthcare sanctions, getting rid of sanctions that restrict people's access to healthcare. So we'll go ahead and sign this petition. It's an effort to denounce sanctions that limit people's access to medical care. I think it's a great initiative that Phil is doing. So here's Phil's petition that he made about opposing sanctions that limit healthcare. Go ahead and sign that petition as a way to show support, to countries that are hit by international sanctions. That's a great effort that we can undertake. And I'm going to put on the closing music. It's been fun. It's been fun. I'll probably be back tomorrow. If it's not tomorrow, I'll be back the next night. I try to stream as much as I possibly can. So there we go.
New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.